All right, econ friends, hello, welcome to lecture. Today, we are going to be starting into topic 2, module 2 of our time together. We're still in that opening phase of economic thinking. Our first topic, those first 4 lectures, were some of the definitions and tenets, some of the big ideas, those toolkit pieces that make economic thinking what it is. Today, we're going to jump into topic 2, module 2, and this is a really important one in economics. We're going to be talking about theories of production, specialization, and especially trade. Trade, as we talked about briefly in our last topic, trade's really important to economists. The idea that trade creates win-win, that trade creates value, really underpins a lot of what we think about in economics. We're always, therefore, looking at ways to increase trade and increase the number of win-win voluntary transactions. And the flip side of that, as a good economic thinker, you always have to be a little bit critical of anybody who makes proposals to restrict or impede trade. So we're going to be talking about trade broadly, but to build up to it, we're going to be thinking about the ideas of production, which is how firms make things, and specialization. Together, these will give us a model of trade that's based on a really critical idea called comparative advantage. So let's jump in. Before we do any of this, though, it's important that we put it in context with the idea of markets, because trade occurs in markets. And one of the first models that you learn in any opening economics class is an oldie but a goodie called the circular flow model. And you can see it right here. Let's first define it. The circular flow model shows how households and businesses interact with each other. Now, when we talked before about utility and profit, we sort of hinted that there's this interdependency between the household sector, which pursues utility, and the firm or the business sector, which pursues profit, okay? But the circular flow brings that into a lot more detail. If you take a look here, you can see in the circular flow model that we have 2 big players, 2 big, I guess we'll call them agents in economic thinking. We have businesses and we have households. Businesses, as we know, are motivated by profit, which was equal to total revenue minus total cost. Total revenue is what a company brings in through its sales. Total cost is how much money they had to spend on raw materials to produce those items. So revenue is the money that comes in, total cost is the cost of production, and profit is what's left over. And obviously, a firm's goal is to maximize profit, okay? Now, down at the household level, we learn that households are motivated by utility. And that's that broad, kind of vague, but, economic term that talks about the pleasure, the satisfaction, the fulfillment, the benefit that people get, that households get when they consume, okay? So we have businesses, we have households. Note that this is a really, really simplified circular flow. More complicated ones would include the foreign sector, would include the government sector, but we're going to take this as a really basic model of a market economy and look at how businesses and households interact. And when you look at this, what you're going to find is that there's 2 big markets, 2 broad markets that the economy runs. One of them is called the product market. You're all familiar with this one. Anytime that you've bought something or maybe sold something, a good or a service, you've participated in the product market, okay? The other one is the resource market. In the product market, that is where goods and services, products, are sold. They're sold by firms to households. They sell them to make profit. We consume them to gain utility. But remember, in order to make products, firms have to have those factors of production, those factors or resources of production: land, labor, and capital. We've talked about those, I think, before, but we'll go into it really quickly. Remember that land refers to kind of, what our hippie friends would call the gifts of nature. All the different materials that are natural to the earth. It could be things like water, it could be the ores for steel, it could be wood and timber, it could be all those things. Natural resources are land resources. Labor resources refer to not just individual workers, although it is workers, but also broadly to the human capital, to the skills, to the experience that those workers bring to a production process. Capital is an economic term for the machinery. You can think of capital as tools that convert land resources into finished products. Okay, so you can think of it this way. You can think labor uses capital to transform land into goods and services. Okay, now that process of converting land, labor, and capital into finished goods and services is called the production process. And that is what firms have to do to maximize, or not just to maximize profit, but to have materials to sell to you, to sell to me, to make money. Now, the big thing to remember from our opening topic is that these three resources are scarce. And as a result of being scarce, they have to be rationed, they have to be sold, they have to be, thoughtfully consumed. That's where resource markets come in. So if you take a look at the circular flow, you will notice that product markets are where businesses send products that we consume. And in return, we give those businesses our money. That allows them to make their profits. But a couple questions come up. Where do we get our money from? The answer is not from Dad's trust fund. The answer is by working, typically. Also tied to this question, where do the companies get the land, labor, and capital that they're converting? Remember, we said under our discussion of private property rights that people, individuals in a capitalistic society can own resources of production. And those private ownership rights, those private property rights, give property holders the exclusive right to sell or exchange or lease out those resources. The answer to this question is in resource or factor markets. In resource or factor markets, households provide the land, labor, and capital that they have exclusive property rights to, and they give those resources to companies. It's the natural flip side. It's a complement to the product market. Okay, so again, in the resource market, households are providing land, labor, and capital to businesses. And in return, businesses have to pay for those factors. And it's the payment of those factors that is the income that households take in. Once again, hinting at that interdependence. A quick little jargon thing for you. In economics, we have mentioned before that there's certain times in economics where an economic term means something very different than like an outside everyday term. That's really the case here. So we said that households will supply resources and businesses will have to give us income for them. Depending on the type of resource you're talking about, the name of the income is different. So in economics, we call rent the payment for land. When you offer a land resource in the resource or product market, I'm sorry, in a resource or a factor market, the payments that you get for that land resource is called rent. The payment for labor, we call in economics wages. Again, I know out in the real world, you think of wages just as your paycheck, but from a technical sense in economics, wages are the income that is derived from selling labor. And finally, we use the term interest to describe the income received from capital. So we have three factors of production: land, labor, and capital. Those factors are supplied by households to businesses in a resource market. And in return, those businesses have to pay us for it. That income is rent, wage, and interest. Okay, let's summarize that real quick. We said a minute ago that the circular flow model shows how households and businesses interact with each other. In the product market, you'll recall it is households that exchange money for the goods and services produced by firms. Goods and services are the two categories of products. Typically, goods are tangible, services are intangible. Simple. To households, this money is considered spending. But to firms, it's considered revenue. So you notice again that the spending on a household has to be the revenue from the firm. That's that reciprocity. That's that flip side. That's that circular flow coming together. Okay. Now that's the product market. In the factor market, which is also called the resource market, it's actually businesses that exchange money for the labor and other resources that we provide as households. To households, this money is income, and to firms, it's considered an expense, a cost that offsets their total revenue to give them their profit. Notice, although we typically would say, if you had economics, you talk about supply and demand, we always assume that it's people who demand because we buy stuff, and it's firms that supply because they sell stuff. But if you take a look in the resource market, it's actually households that are supplying. We're supplying land and labor and capital, and it's firms that are demanding. Okay, so every business is both a buyer and a seller at times, and every individual or every household is both a buyer and a seller at times as well. It depends if we're operating in the product market or the factor market. Okay, final thing, we talked about these markets. Considering what we covered in topic 1, why do these trades and transactions occur? And the answer should be very simple: because we win-win, right? These trades and transactions in these things are win-win transactions, and the incentives are there in the form of profit, in the form of income, in the form of utility to enable the trade. Okay, so again, we're taking all these different concepts and always trying to find ways to mesh them together. All right, so that's the idea of the circular flow. It's a real basic model. It's something that you need to be thinking about, simply because it's narrow to think that it's always people buying and firms selling. Good economics understands the flow of resources, the interdependence of the different players. Sometimes households buy, sometimes we sell. Sometimes firms sell, sometimes they buy. Take a look at the circular flow model, give it some thought, and that'll be it for now. Next time we start, we'll jump in to the production possibility frontier model, which is another really simple, really basic, but really important model that we learn in intro economics. Thanks for your time. Talk to you soon.